There is a gulf emerging, a world of difference between state and society in Iran at the moment. And I think it's really important for listeners to appreciate that.
I'm David Knowles, and this is Battle Lines. On today's bonus episode of Battle Lines, we speak to Professor Ali Ansari, author and founding director of the Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of St Andrews. With the recent death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash, Iranian politics is set for yet another shift, with an increasingly youthful secular population suffering through a dire economic situation. Some say the stranglehold of the Iranian clerics, known as the ulama, is waning. Could Iran be due for yet another revolution? I spoke to Professor Ali Ansari to better understand the Iranian mindset. Ali, thank you so much for your time. Can we start with quite a broad question then? Where do you find the origins of modern Iran, the sort of the ingredients in the recipe that make up the contemporary social, political, cultural life of the country?
Well, it depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at the development of modern Iran as we know it, then that's really a creation of, the constitutional revolution about 100 years ago. I mean, that's really the construction of the state. If you're looking at the ideology of the modern Islamic Republic or the contemporary Islamic Republic, then that's really a feature, obviously, of the revolution in 1979. So what you have is almost like a twofold construction. One is obviously the construction of the physical state, if you will, but the other is the ideology that shapes it. And it's the ideology that shapes it, really, that's affecting what we're seeing at the moment.
Can we talk about that ideology? What's the importance of the revolution in 1970? What comes out of that?
Well, the revolution, in very simple terms, turned Iran from essentially a pro-Western monarchy into an anti-Western, although in its origins it was meant to be neither East nor West, but an anti-Western Islamic Republic, which basically sought to combine the best elements, if you will, of the French Fifth Republic with the best elements of Islamic theology. It was not a happy marriage, to be straightforward. There were attempts basically to reconcile these two trends, and I think they went some way to try and do it really in the first 20 years of the revolutionary experience. But following really from the early noughties, what we see is a direction of travel that sees the Islamic autocracy, if you will, and the authoritarianism of the Islamic Revolution trump the Republican institutions, those Republican aspects of the revolution. And what you're seeing today really is a state that is a republic in name only. I mean, it doesn't really function in any sort of meaningful way as a republic anymore, other than to basically convince, I think, gullible people abroad that, it's a quasi-democracy or something. But it isn't really by any stretch of the imagination, and most Iranians recognize that.
So this theology of the Islamic Republic, so-called, what is it exactly? Can you place it within Islam for us?
Well, it's a sort of a heady mix of radical left-wing ideology, and the best way perhaps to talk about it is Islamic liberation theology, if I can put it that way. And it essentially argues for, a complete, I have to say, revision of the global order in the interests of its own understanding of justice. And I think we have to be very careful about that in one sense, because one is to look at it from their perspective. Their goal is obviously a just world order. But what does that just world order imply? It really means an order shaped in their own image. And it's an image that a lot of people, including in Iran, aren't very keen on. So, what they're looking for ultimately is this sort of reshaping of the post-war global order. And what I mean by that is the post-1945 global order in a sort of a Shia, if I may put it, a Shia sort of model. Now, what that means is that they sort of marry this sort of sense of injustice about the world and the global order with this strong conviction in the return of the hidden Imam, for instance. So there's a strong millenarian tendency to that. Now, the important thing to distinguish here is it's not apocalyptic, by the way. I don't think people need to be that unnerved by it. But some elements of it are pretty unnerving. I mean, they see, for instance, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza and the war as all part of one long, great struggle against Western hegemony. That's the way they see it. And some of them are very engaged with it, it has to be said. The vast majority of Iranians are not, but the hardliners within the system see this as part of a broader struggle for the reshaping of the global order.
Could we just go into a bit more detail there? The hidden Imam, who is he? What should we know about him? And also, just on that, the way you're describing it makes it sound a bit like American politics, where you have, there would be certain politicians who really are sort of evangelical Christians who will believe in certain bits of doctrine. Is that a fair analogy or not?
Well, I think, you can get religious extremism everywhere. I think the difference in Iran in some ways is that you're getting religious extremism that's actually governing the state rather than contesting it. But certainly that's true. I mean, I think there are several distinctions with Iran that are worth bearing in mind. One is that institutionally the state is quite weak, which means that people, individuals, personalities are stronger, and there's less stability, if you can put it that way. So in the United States, there are very serious challenges to the nature of the United States and its character. But ultimately, one suspects that, all things being equal, that the institutions will allow it to retain its character, albeit it can only take so much punishment. That's true, but nonetheless, there's an institutional basis there that protects it. And these are really features of what we would understand as the modern state. I think in Iran, the modern state in that sense has yet to be institutionalized in a way that we would be familiar in the West. So the hidden imam, just to go back to that, I mean, Iran is a Shia country. It's a 12er Shia country. It believes in the line of the imams from the Prophet Muhammad down through his son-in-law and cousin, the Imam Ali. And then obviously, as the 12er denomination notes, it's 12 imams until the last one. And the last imam, basically, nobody's ever seen. And it is argued went into occultation. And the notion of occultation is not that he's disappeared. It's basically, as the name suggests, he's hidden. And so the hidden imam is as people describe it, is this idea of the sun behind the clouds. So the hidden imam is there, but has yet to reveal himself. And this, of course, allows all sorts of weird and wonderful religious movements to emerge, particularly those who believe that they are in contact with the hidden imam, or the hidden imam has reached out to them, unlike others. And in Orthodox Shiism, it has to be said, and I stress that, Orthodox Shiism, because they're aware of this tendency, they've always said that anyone who claims to have talked to the hidden imam is either a bit simple or mad. But of course, in the Islamic Republic, this is not the case. There are a number of people, including famously Ahmadinejad, the President Ahmadinejad, the one prior to Rouhani, who claim to be in regular contact with the hidden imam. And of course, the cult of the supreme leader that is currently basically dominating in Iran today, Ayatollah Khamenei, he's meant to have some sort of contact with the hidden imam as well, and to basically replicate his powers on earth. And it's very important for people in the West to appreciate what this means, by the way, because what you have in Iran is not a sort of a notion of divine right monarchy, or the sort of thing that you might have been familiar with in early modern Europe. This is much more serious. I mean, this is much more emphatic, that in the absence of the hidden imam, until the hidden imam reveals himself, Ayatollah Khamenei retains all his powers and is able to activate those powers. And that gives him an enormous amount of remit, including, dare I say, the ability to alter Islamic law if the interests of the state require it. It's an astonishing array of powers, by the way. And I don't think people in the West fully appreciate what the hardline revolutionaries in Iran are aspiring to. So it's quite dramatic. I have to say, there are some nice parallels these days, somewhat depressingly, with what's going on in Russia. I mean, if you look at Archbishop Kirill and the way that Putin and Medvedev actually spout on, I've often wondered whether they're supping a little bit too much at Ayatollah Khamenei's knee. But they also have some very weird and wonderful religious ideas.
What's the relationship between contemporary Iran and its own image and Persia? I mean, do they see a continuity there? How do they think of their own history?
Interestingly, they do. They do. So the regime uses ancient history and its pre-Islamic history when it suits its purpose. I don't think it necessarily believes in it. One of the striking images that came out in the aftermath of the missile strike against Israel was lots of people started putting out memes, posters, whatever, of Khamenei as Cyrus the Great. And this is so absurd. I mean, it's so ridiculous. It's not even worth contemplating. But the fact that they do it is interesting, because they're trying to reach out to that nationalist constituency, both within the country and obviously abroad. And they're trying to say that the dignity and might of Iran has been restored. This is complete nonsense, but they do use it. And they do see a continuity when it serves their interests. So, for instance, on the nuclear program, they're very keen to see the continuity with the Shah, because they think that under the Shah, the nuclear program was supported, which of course it was, but up to a point, I have to say. But the point is that the 1970s are quite different in terms of the time period. And of course, the ideology of the Shah was also quite different to what the ideology of the Islamic Republic is. But you'll find in there, for instance, there was a wonderful article written by an Iranian foreign minister way back during when the negotiations were happening, actually, saying that the United States was extremely supportive of Iran's nuclear program, but something happened. But after 1979, for some reason, everything changed, as if it was a complete mystery. And I said to someone, this is an extraordinary sort of ability to whitewash the revolution, in a sense, and pretend that there's one long continuity. But of course, in other things, they're not interested in continuity at all. In other things, they want to say that they're quite different, that they've changed things. So what I find as a historian very interesting, of course, is the way in which they've appropriated the pre-Islamic past to serve their ideological and political interests. I think, again, this is a sign really of weakness by them, by the way, because they know that they can't appeal that most people aren't particularly interested in if the hidden Imam is about to turn up or not. But they get all very excited when you mention Cyrus the Great. So they will play on that, and they will stress that element of continuity. I should stress, by the way, just in line with your questioning, in terms of, you have to bear in mind that the term Iran, in that sense, is Iran and Persia are the same country. It's just that Persia was the name that Westerners called the country until really the 20th century. I will say this, given it's a Telegraph pod, is that I think the Daily Telegraph was the last paper to switch from Persia to Iran in 1979, believe it or not, which I thought was quite striking. Almost everyone else did it much earlier. But again, this was simply a question of people in Iran saying, could you please call the country by the name that we call the country and not call it by Persia? So I just want to stress that, because people get confused and say that Iran is a new country. It's not. Travelers to Iran from at least the 17th century onwards recognized that natives called the country Iran. So I just wanted to emphasize that. But yeah, the level of, how should we say, continuity is something that the regime likes to stress in order to give it a bit of sort of legitimacy.
I think that's a wonderful summation of where we are in Iran.
Yeah.
Could you just place them sort of strategically and regionally? Who are their friends? Who are their enemies? And why?
Well, their chief friend at the moment is Russia. I mean, interesting enough, they've really bound in with Russia. And this is something that's emerged after the war in Syria, basically after the Arab Spring, and their decision to combine their efforts in suppressing the dissent against Assad, which has been suppressed at quite a high rate of brutality, I have to say. I mean, we sort of largely forget it now, but it's been a pretty savage war. And so that's their chief friend. I think they have a sort of an aspiration to be quite good chums of the Chinese, but the Chinese, I think, keep them at arm's length. I mean, the Chinese use the Iranians insofar as it can irritate the Americans, but that's about it. And then in the region, of course, you've got Syria, to some extent the Iraqis, but that's partly because the Iranians are heavily embedded and are basically manipulating Iraqi politics. So that's a bit of a love-hate relationship. Obviously, you've got with the Houthis in Yemen. But by and large, interestingly enough, Iran's friends are very few and far between in terms of genuine friends. And interestingly, I think even the Russians there are a sort of it's an awkward relationship. There's been some quite striking commentary and speculation, or educated speculation, if you will, about how on earth the Israelis were able to garner intelligence about where these IRGC commanders were on the 1st of April before they did their strike. And there's some suggestion that the Syrians or even the Russians might have informed the Israelis. Who knows? But it's quite interesting in terms of the narrative that's going on. We do know, for instance, that the Russians and the Syrians have often found the IRGC presence and the Iranian presence in Syria less than helpful. You've done your bit. It's about time you went. And of course, they don't want to go anywhere. So there's a lot of the interesting thing about the relationships there is I don't think any of them could be approximate to the sort of relationship you have among Western allies, of which we see, so much friction. But at the end of the day, I think the fundamentals are probably quite sound. The allies that Iran has are very, how should we say, that they're basically a convenience of interest, but they're not. Even with the Russians, I'd say the Russians are pretty tight, but even with the Russians, there's a feeling that both sides could walk away without really many qualms. They don't feel bound by any treaty obligation, let's put it that way.
And just to focus on a couple of their close neighbours, what's their relationship like with Saudi? And maybe it'd be interesting to hear about the Emirates as well. Many years ago was in the Emirates, and I was astonished to hear the sort of the competition between the two countries. I didn't know the history at all, so it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on it.
I mean, there's a sort of a détente really between them in the sense that, now what I say, an uneasy détente, because obviously both the Saudis and the UAE are a little bit anxious about being part of the fallout of any wider regional war in which the Iranians have already said, by the way, that if anything happens, they'll lay waste to the region. That's a way of basically getting the Saudis and the UAE in line and not having them be so robust really in their antagonism, which they were in the last few years. They were very active, certainly during the heyday of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement and its run-up. There was a lot of a lot of leaks about how the Saudis in particular were very much against the direction of travel there. Now, I think since last year, there was this sort of Chinese brokered agreement with the Saudis. And there's been a lot of hoo-ha about this, I have to say, and how marvelous it is and great strategic triumph for the Chinese and the Iranians. I think as we've seen in the recent missile attack on Israel, that sort of relationship only went so far because it seems to be that the Saudis also participated in helping, certainly either with intelligence or even with material, in hindering the Iranian attack. I think that relationship is a fairly tense one. The Saudis don't want to be involved. They don't want to feel that their oil assets are going to be targets of Iranian missiles. They feel, I think, the Saudis somewhat let down by the Americans in terms of the sort of protective umbrella, and therefore they've had to seek some sort of modus vivendi with the Iranians. But there's no love lost there. That's very, very clear. And if anything, this recent attack on Israel showed very much that given, push comes to shove, many of these Arab states will actually not only stay neutral, but they'll actually defend the Israeli situation, which is an astonishing place to be, I have to say. And it does show the limitations of Iran's regional influence and its military clout. In fact, I mean, my own view is that the attack on when was it, the 13th of April, far from being a great success, actually highlighted a number of real frailties in the Iranian position, not only technical, but also allied. And I think for me, one of the great, I think, statements of great spins of recent time was Ayatollah Khomeini, I think a couple of days ago, said, it's not the hitting the target that matters, it's the fact that we fired the missiles. So I thought that's great. Okay, so it's not the winning that matters, it's the taking part. In that way, he was encouraging his troops on, but it was a slightly odd bit of encouragement that he basically said, it doesn't matter if you didn't hit anything, as long as you fired them.
You've mentioned some of the names in the regime. Who are the movers and shakers? Who should we be aware of?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, actually, because the real mover and shaker, of course, is Khamenei himself, the supreme leader, who's somewhat frail and not entirely in control of his abilities these days because he's quite ill. And it's really his household that matters. People like Golpayegani and others who are part of the inner court, if you will. And then, obviously, the leaders in the IRGC. There are a number of key officials in the IRGC. Hajizadeh is the missile czar, for instance. And there are various others, particularly for the Quds Force and others who are going to be influential. The interesting thing is, in terms of the really influential people on the inside track, they're not on the front, they're not front facing. So you can pick out different people who are, quote, what you'd call influencers on the hardline element, some of whom were elected in that rather sham parliamentary election that occurred a couple of months ago. But at the end of the day, the power and the authority is very, very heavily centralized through the supreme leader and those who are able to influence him. But he takes the final decision. This is where I think some of the people who argue for complex decision-making processes in the Islamic Republic miss the point, really. I mean, the point is, at the end of the day, the only person who can actually make the decision is the supreme leader. Everyone else can give advice and suggest things and whatever. How influential they are is a matter of debate. But at the end of the day, they can say whatever they want. It's not that they have any role in decision-making. It's not comparable, for instance, with what the US system is or any of the European countries where you have diverse centres of influence and authority.
Could you give us a flavour then of sort of national, local Iranian politics? What matters to people? What are the issues that really matter?
Well, what really matters in Iran is the economy, by the way. I mean, the economy is in a dire situation and people will debate this. And never has the term lies, damn lies and statistics been more apposite than any in an economic discussion of the situation in Iran. Because you'll get any number of sort of assessments and people will claim that they're doing better or it's difficult to say it's doing worse, but let's say it's doing better than it is. But of course, this is the way you read the stats and how you choose to read the data that the government, by the way, is giving you. I mean, this is one of the other interesting things that I find, that often when they say, the IMF has said that the economy is growing by 2%. Well, first of all, the IMF has to base its figures on the statistics that the government's giving them, which aren't particularly reliable. But two, actually, even if we did accept it was 2% growth is completely insufficient to deal with the problems that Iran is facing. So we have a slide in the currency that's been sliding steadily over the last 2-3 years. To be honest, it will blip up and down now and then. If you looked at it daily, it might get better one day, it might get worse another. But the overall trend is very, very clear. You've seen a sort of to give you an example, in the last 6 years, the value of the currency at the free market rate, certainly, which is the real rate in effect, has declined tenfold versus the pound. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, inflation is fairly rampant. There are extraordinary price rises in very basic goods, by the way. So, I mean, this is the interesting thing. The government says that they have an official rate, which is, I think, 2/3 of the market rate, which it uses to import essential goods. The average monthly salary is 11 million tomans, which is 110 million riyals. Okay, so think about that for a start. The average price of a car, if I remember correct, of a cheap car, Kia Pride, not to be offensive to Kia, it's a fairly sort of staple sort of car for them. What people are saying is that it'll take the average, and we're talking about average, not the poorest, the average worker, 19 months if he didn't spend on anything else at all to be able to save up for a car. But, other things, just staple foods and stuff, it's quite expensive to buy meat, for instance, rice and other things, which are stable. So these are all things that I think bother people. I mean, this is what it affects them and that's what bothers them. I mean, on the other hand, then the government has decided now is the time to redeploy their morality police and get women back into the veil and stuff. I mean, excellent timing there. And of course, they're using huge brutality on this occasion, partly because I think they thought they could use the cover of a struggle with Israel to do it. But it's elicited an enormous reaction in Iran, a very bad reaction among even people who are broadly supportive of the regime, saying, why the hell are you beating up women? So obviously, this is just not right. And so now there's a reaction to that. People saying, no, some of the morality police are acting outside the law, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, by the way. But they said, oh my God, people are acting beyond the law. But clearly they're using a lot of violence. And we've already had the death of one woman, by the way, but it hasn't been noticed because on this occasion, everyone's focused on Iran and Israel. It's a good cover for them, you see. So those are the things. I think what people want in Iran is very basic, actually. I mean, it's not rocket science. They want good governance, a sound economy. They want to be able to travel. They want to be able to sort of be integrated to the world. They don't want to be fighting the rest of the world. They don't believe in this radical ideology that the regime is spouting out. But the regime, for its own interests, and this is not unusual, as I said, sort of thinks that a good conflict abroad is a good distraction and maintain that antagonism and it allows them to stay in power. I am one of the sort of probably handful of people in the analytical community, and coming as a historian, I have to say, I feel that this is a recipe for disaster for the regime. I don't think they can sustain this forever, and certainly for any length of time. At the end of the day, the regime always had a degree of durability because it was always able to take the release the pressure cooker a little bit, adjust elections, always play that game. But in the last 6-7 years, it's done absolutely nothing of that. It's just tightened on the screws more and doubled down. And the more you do that, the more brittle and fragile the whole system becomes.
What do you think may happen?
Well, I think there are a number of things that could happen. I mean, there's one theory, of course, is that the regime can muddle on. I mean, certainly it can muddle on. But I think my own view is that its capacity to absorb shocks will decrease as we proceed, and each shock will be a major test for it. And whether it can sustain that is another matter. And what you're going to see, I think, is a gradual deterioration of the authority of the state, and basically factional fighting will break out. I mean, Iran is already basically contested by a number of different, even in Iran they call mafias, basically, who are competing in turf wars, essentially. And I think you'll see a lot of that breaking out. And certainly, I think, as the supreme leader reaches his demise and there's a succession coming in place, and most people assume that his son is going to take over, by the way, which is another sign that things are not entirely healthy in the republic. If that takes place, I think there will be a lot of contention over that and a lot of contestation. And I think those who sorely or are keen advocates of this hereditary succession are determined to get it through. And I think one of the interesting things will be, in the first instance, is the amount of infighting that will take place in the elite. I wouldn't worry about the wider society at the moment. I think if you are a member of the political elite in Iran, it's a very dangerous time to be alive.
Coming on to our final questions then, what advice would you give to diplomats working with Iranian diplomats? How would you advise them to read them? How would you advise them? What do they take seriously? What do they not? How do you work with them?
Well, the first thing I'd say to any Western or any diplomat working with Iran is, first of all, brush up, please. Brush up a little bit on history, a little bit on culture, and a little bit on language. You have to understand what people are saying to you, why and how, and what is, when people are being vague or obtuse, what that actually means. Sometimes they say what you see is what you get. Other times things are very heavily disguised. And I think you need to be able to make the difference and to make the distinction. I think that's very, very important. I'm always in favor of a measure of dialogue. I don't think it's a good idea to be entirely in a confrontational posture with anyone. We talked to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. But the point is, have a realistic assessment of the country you're dealing with and stop pretending, in a sense, that there are just moderates busting to get out. And if only we were nicer and hugged them closer, everything will be good. I think that train has left the station and we need to move on and understand who we're dealing with. And if we know who we're dealing with and understand that and have our red lines, by the way, and we have to be very clear about our red lines, I think actually the relationship for them as well, in some ways, will become clarified and people will realize those red lines that they can't cross. At the moment, we're so vague in terms of our relationship with Iran. We're all like tiptoeing around them that, like the bully in the playground, the Iranians don't, and I'm talking about the regime here, obviously not Iranians as well, the Iranian regime that sort of can't believe its luck almost. It almost gets away with literally gets away with murder, by the way. But the thing is that in doing that, you're encouraging them to try to test the West. And the fear I have really is that they take it so far that there will come a time when the West cannot but respond in a much more serious way. Much better to be a bit tougher now, a bit clearer now, and state your red lines to make sure they never get to that stage. Do you see what I mean? I think this is the problem. As to what happens within Iran, by the way, I don't think there's a huge amount that anyone in the West can do about it. I think the best thing that in the West you can really do about it is, as I say to people, do no harm. Don't go around encouraging the worst elements in the regime. As far as you possibly can, encourage the best elements in Iranian society, those younger people who are aspiring for those freedoms. But given the clumsiness of Western policy over the last 20, 30 years, I don't hold very high expectations that they'll be able to do that. So my view is that you have to stand back, observe, contain as far as possible, and set out your own position very clearly about what you can and cannot do. I wouldn't suggest or intimate or recommend that there's any sort of type of interference or manipulation. I don't think it works. I think you just need to quote a great line from, I think it was Napoleon, who said, "Don't interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake." So while the Iranians are busy screwing themselves, essentially, the regime that is, why get involved? It's not you need to set your red lines and make sure they don't cross those. But I wouldn't get involved in the nitty-gritty of domestic Iranian politics at all.
We've spoken about politics, about strategy and geopolitics, but just to finish, what's your favorite piece of Iranian culture or something away from all of that that you would want listeners
I tell you what I think,
know
what I find I really enjoy about Iranian culture is the humor. I love the humor. And it's the sort of humor you can only get in a very repressive state where people make jokes almost about everything, and it keeps people sane.
And is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for our listeners to hear and understand?
I think one of the things that I just would like to stress is that there is a gulf emerging, a world of difference between state and society in Iran at the moment. And I think it's really important for listeners to appreciate that I know this is something that bothers a lot of observers, that there's a tendency sometimes to talk about Iran when really we should be talking about the Islamic Republic or the Islamic Revolution. Again, everyone shorthands. That's not a problem. We all do it. But I think I would hope that listeners would appreciate the fact that there is actually a world of difference between the people in Iran who are quite antithetical to and actually probably antagonistic to the way the regime is carrying on at the moment. And really, I think in the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a sea change in opinion among the Iranian populace, and a demand for secularism, the removal of religion from politics, all this sort of thing is now so emphatically part of the mainstream in Iranian society that there's a direction of travel. It's going in quite the opposite direction to the way in which the Islamic Revolution is trying to go. And I think this is one of the reasons why you're going to see a lot of tensions in the future.
Ali Ansari, thank you so much for your time.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Dagahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.